Joel, why don't you introduce us and remind them about the contest?
Right. So my name is Joel. I'm from Canada. I'm an executive VP at. Yay! Who else is from Canada? Let me hear you. Yay! Who's going to the airport right after this?
Yeah.
Yin? No.
Yeah, Joel's going straight to the airport.
Straight to the airport.
He cannot be late because his wife will yell at me.
Yes, she will yell at him. I work at Telerik. I'm an executive VP in charge of the Agile Project Management Division. And before coming to Telerik, I worked a lot with companies all over the world as an Agile coach. Worked with them on adopting brand new methodologies. I worked for large organizations like the US military all the way down to small startup orgs. And the goal was to think about how we can bring in brand new practices to make waste go away, to make quality go up, and make teams really, really happy. And more importantly, make businesses very, very happy and a lot of money. So with that, we kind of brought a lot of our learnings into the Telerik world. And I've been speaking on Agile now at TechEd for probably almost 7 or 8 years.
Yep. And my name is Stephen Forte, and I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Telerik as well. You probably heard this yesterday, but Telerik is based in Sofia, Bulgaria, and I am not Bulgarian. And I am from New York City, but I live in Hong Kong. And so it's always a little confusing trying to schedule a meeting with me or which phone number to call. Right? Is it my Hong Kong phone, my Sofia phone? But I'm a Microsoft MVP in SQL Azure, and I'm a certified Scrum Master. Before I was at Telerik, probably for about 10 years, I've been practicing some form of Agile methodology, and sometimes not even realizing I was. I was practicing some early forms of XP in the .com era and didn't even realize it. It was actually by accident. Same with Kanban, which we'll get into in just a moment. But I started practicing Kanban, and I didn't even realize I was doing it. I thought I was kind of modifying Scrum or something like that. And I'm also, speaking of Scrum, a certified Scrum Master. And I want to say off the top, we're not here to convince you to move away from Scrum. We just want to teach you about an alternative Agile methodology. In some areas, Scrum and Kanban will be complementary. And in some areas, they won't be. And it's up for you to either implement Kanban full blast or take pieces of Kanban and implement that in your organization. So we're just here to present the information. Don't make any value judgments in that respect. We're both certified Scrum Masters, so we do believe in pretty much all Agile methodologies.
I'd like to maybe get to the why. Steve and I have been passionate about Kanban. We've been talking about Kanban and using aspects of Kanban on our projects for many years now. And from my experience, Kanban and some of the principles behind it, being from the lean manufacturing world, have been the most significant impact on how we think about managing projects and work since we started doing Agile. That's how impactful it's actually been on a lot of our teams. So we're really, really passionate about Kanban and how it fits into the world of Agile and how it complements everything that we're doing today. The principles that we're going to be discussing has really made a tremendous impact on everything from better predictability on projects to really increased quality on top of everything else that we've been doing.
Oh, goodness, you didn't.
You notice he has an entire additional slide on himself?
All right. All right.
I
sent the slide last night. I sent the slide deck to Joel and said, put in our bio. I would have assumed he would have taken out my bio.
You gave me a backlog item that says, put in our bio. You did not have the backlog item that said, take out yours.
This is the typical problem with software developers, right? We say, build a water bottle. What do you get? We say, where's the cap? You didn't tell me to build the cap. This is Exhibit A.
That's better than actually people doing more than what you asked them for, right?
Which is a little bit of what Kanban is about.
Yeah.
All right, let's get rolling into what is Kanban. We'll give a brief overview, and then we'll dive into a little bit of kind of the history of Kanban, and then we'll get to applying it to a software project. So we're going to spend probably 5 or 10 minutes about the history of Kanban as well. And at any point, feel free to ask a question. I think the room is small enough where you can probably just raise your hand, and when one of us acknowledges you, you can kind of shout it out. But we'll repeat the question. Of course, you can always line up at a microphone as well. That will help the other folks hear you as well. Do you want to start off, Joel? Because then I could talk about my tires.
Kanban is not something that's new. However, it seems to be very popular, or growing popularity in the Agile community. One of the reasons for that is because it has a similar purpose of the, it kind of reflects the agile principles that we so know and love. Now, Kanban is not something new. Kanban has actually been around for quite a long time and has its roots in lean manufacturing, also called the Toyota production management system. And that started off, the whole lean movement, that mindset that we've embraced in manufacturing was actually embraced in about 1945, 1946, and has evolved considerably since then. I find it very ironic that it's taken us 50 plus years to look to the lean community to think about how we can develop software better. But we're doing more and more of that as we go along. So Kanban came about as people started to use a lot of visualized boards in their work environment that represent the states that all of their components that they were building were in. And then someone came along and says, hey, that's much like the Kanban boards that we use in the lean world. And it's been proven to really identify or allow you to visualize the flow of your system and then really allow you to kind of pop out opportunities for process improvement and bottlenecks and then keep the major focus of your team, which is getting things done. Right? It embraces that things don't have a lot of value if they're not done. So we should really focus on getting them done without sacrificing quality by having a lot of checks and balances in there so we can improve quality. And Kanban kind of embraces all of these instruments that we know and love in Agile, and therefore has actually started to be quite well adopted in the Agile community.
So one of the things that Kanban stresses, and we're still talking very generically about Kanban, meaning is we're weaving it into technology, but we're going to still spend a few minutes on just talking about Kanban from a manufacturing space and then dovetail and bring that framework over to technology. But as Joel said, it stresses about visualization of the work, and that's how software developers kind of discovered Kanban. And it also really focuses on just-in-time delivery of the raw materials that are needed for what the person is working on. And the reason why it focuses on the just-in-time delivery of those raw materials, and right now I'm talking about Kanban in kind of the manufacturing space, but it's the same thing for a developer, right? Just-in-time delivery of your work items. It's workers will get what they need when they need it, no sooner. Why? The reason is it will eliminate inventory or eliminate waste, because inventory is waste. When you have inventory building up, you have bottlenecks, you have waste, you have to pay to store that inventory. That inventory does not actually get utilized. It's actually a waste of money. So one of the things is, where does Kanban come from? Joel said it came from the Toyota production system right after World War II. And one of the things we could do is just kind of describe how Kanban got started. And picture way back, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, a guy on an assembly line at Toyota building a car. And his job is to pick up a tire and put it onto the actual car that's coming down the assembly line. Right, so he's picking up the tire and he's putting it on. He's picking up the tire and he's putting it on. He has a stack of tires this high. And eventually he's going to run out of tires. And to be more efficient, you don't want him to have to say, hey, I need more tires, and then sit around and wait for the tires to show up. And then cars are coming by without any tires, and then you guys buy some Toyotas with only 3 tires on them. That would probably not be a good thing.
Bad brakes.
Yeah, well, bad brakes. Oh, wait. We're not supposed to talk about that. Though we should address the earthquake. Joel and I had an interesting email conversation after the earthquake about lean manufacturing, but we'll get there. So I'm the guy putting the tires on. Maybe the tire gets to here, and a card is displayed. And I probably am a little ahead of myself, but a card might look something like that. And this is called a Kanban card, or actually it's just called a Kanban, because in Japanese, Kanban literally translates to English for signal card. So, the guy who's put the tire gets the card, and it says, order more tires. You're going to be out soon. So he walks over, or probably gives it to somebody, and gives it to Joel.
Thank you.
And Joel is in the tire production department. So I'll be Joel right now, right? So he's the guy, taking the raw materials, the rubber, taking the rubber and making them into tires. Or, if it's not vertically integrated like that, he might be the person who orders the tires from the tire manufacturer. But he turns around and says, Steve on the assembly floor needs more tires. In the amount of time it takes him to order and procure the tires and deliver them to them, Now we're back to me in the tire plant. I take my last tire up and I put it on the car. In the back of my head, I'm thinking, oh crap, I'm out of tires. I put the tire onto the car. I turn around, there's another pile magically there. Someone came and delivered it because I handed that Kanban card off to Joel. Now, before we kind of deconstruct this a little bit and talk about it, is what happens to Joel? Joel's building the tires. He's going to come to his own Kanban card. At some point, he's going to be low on rubber. And he's going to get a Kanban card that looks like something like that and says, time to order more rubber. And he's going to give it off to Bob, who's in the rubber ordering department. Okay? And then Bob is going to go and order some rubber when he gets down. So what these signal cards are doing is watching the system, is managing the inventory and helping items flow through the system in a predictable rate. So we don't want the tire guy to be standing there with no tires. We don't want the rubber guy there, with no rubber. But we also don't want there to be 5 piles of tires in front of me when I'm at the tire department. Despise the fact that they could fall over on me. That's just wasteful, right? On the factory floor, it's just we've produced too many tires. And we also don't want me to have no tires. So through a system of trial and error, Toyota figured out at what rate does Steve work. How fast does he put tires on the car? That translates to a certain point in my workflow to hand off to Joel. At what rate does Joel work at? Translate to his workflow. When you add it all together, you can actually measure flow. And here's the flow. How long does it take to produce a car, right? How long does it take the car to flow through the system from beginning to end?
And this is a different mindset shift. Now, we're not maybe used to this in the project world. We're not maybe used to this if we're, used to pushing work, because this is different. This is about creating a vacuum and sucking work in. That's the premise that we have now. We'll be using that term over and over and over again, called pull. Instead of pushing work, we're pulling it based on the vacuum that we're creating it. We create a vacuum, we suck in the work to fill the vacuum, and it turns out that that model is a much more efficient model when it comes to thinking about getting things done, right? And this has been proven over and over and over again in manufacturing. And we're here to talk about how this can apply to software development and how, obviously we're not assembly line workers. I mean, when I first started talking about lean manufacturing about 8 years ago on how it applies to software engineering, I would get bonked on the head. It's like, Joel, we're not assembly line workers. We're not. We write code. We don't just put tires on cars. And, you start to rethink, and we're not. But there's another part of lean manufacturing. It's called design engineering. How do the designers who build and design the car work, right? They work much like we do. They're creative. They're creating things from scratch. There's a lot of uncertainty in what they're doing when they're designing new product. But they still use a very pull model to be much more predictive and have a high quality of deliverables that they actually set up. So we're much more like design engineers, the people who design the cars before it gets to the manufacturing model. But we can still use some of these pull models to think about work organization, structure, and flow itself.
So let's start thinking about flow and how items will flow through the system, and then we'll start applying this directly to a technology project, which Joel already started to do. So if we're actually pulling things through the system and we have no inventory, with no inventory there's no waste. But if there's inventory, things can't flow. There's bottlenecks. And here's the translation when we move over to software development, is we're looking to eliminate bottlenecks in our organization. We're looking to increase the flow so we know how long it takes work items to flow through the system and then get to completion. As Joel said, getting actually to done. So let's actually go in and talk about Kanban for technology projects. So one of the ways that the folks, well, it's actually a guy named David Anderson who Joel has worked with before. And David Anderson worked on a project at Microsoft and started defining a system and stumbled across Kanban. It's an interesting story because he didn't realize he was using Kanban until someone kind of told him. He said, hey, what you're doing is actually Kanban. And he went and researched it and looked at everything and realized, yeah, it's actually kind of coming from lean manufacturing. So the way it works in a software project is the first thing you need to do is define a workflow and then visualize it. I always joke around with Joel, if you have a Software and agile methodology, it's not agile if you don't have some kind of board. Right? Scrum has a board. We always need some type of board to put it on. It's a little bit of a joke, but at the same time is visualizing the workflow is very important in Scrum. It's extremely important in Kanban because it gives you the opportunity to actually visualize your flow and then look for the bottlenecks. And there's a specific way we'll do that, which we'll be talking about pretty shortly. So then what you do is you organize the queue and you say, the items in my flow are going to be broken down into sections. And let's just think at an extremely high level of a software development project. It could be, how about some good ones, Joel, like just analysis, coding. I mean, it's not really agile, almost using waterfall terms, but you could have, coding, testing to production, right? I mean, at a very high level. And we would call these swim lanes on the board. But here's what's interesting. Let's think back to my analogy with the tires. Do you remember when I was with the tires and at a certain point I came to my Kanban card? So how do we translate that to software development? In the software development world, we will actually define limits to each particular queue. So meaning is the developers might only be allowed to work on 3 work items at the same time. And that's called limiting the work in progress. So what will happen is the developers will have 3 items to work on. The items in the queue before it might be, UX design, and they might only have 2 things to work on at the same time. And then the items before that might be, user story complete, and the items after that might be testing, and they might have only 4 or 5 items to work on. But now you actually have a flow not dissimilar to that assembly line. As I said, I'm not saying developers are an assembly line, but now you actually have a flow, and we're limiting the work in progress. So instead of physically because we're not doing manual labor in software, right? We're picking up a tire. In manual labor, we're picking up a tire and putting it on a car, and then there's an actual Kanban card in front of you. In the software development world, we do this by limiting the actual work in progress on our Kanban board. Want to add to that?
Well, and I think what's one of the key aspects of this particular slide is that with Kanban, there's not a lot of rules other than rule number 1, which is to evolve. We really embrace change within Kanban. Do we always know what states things need to be in, Steve, when we actually set up our swim lanes? Nah.
Nope.
But we take a stab at it. The thing is that the Kanban board will tell us where we should actually optimize things as we go along. We can clearly see bottlenecks on our visual representation. As we could fix that by adding a new state or changing some of the work in progress limits that I have set up for my environment. And it tells us this, and it allows us to optimize our flow. So that there's no, I always use the analogy of a pipe pushing water through it. In fact, we're pulling water through it. And what we actually don't want to have is an air bubble in that pipe. And what we can see inside of the Kanban board is that air bubble. We can say we can get rid of that air bubble. We can see it, and the first way that we can optimize our process is by first identifying the bubble. And then second of all, we can work as a team to figure out how we can eliminate that bubble so that we can actually get smoother flow through the system. And that's what Kanban is based on, is change. Right? So if we don't have enough states, add a new state. If you don't have the right work in progress limits, change the work in progress limits and change real time. Don't wait till after the project's done. Don't do a post-mortem on your projects after it's dead. You want to keep it alive. You're doing an extra shot to the heart to keep it up and going by changing the process real time.
And I don't want to make this a session of comparing Kanban to other agile methodologies. I'd rather have it stand on its own. But since we all are familiar with something like Scrum, I do want to contrast that Scrum is very fixed and by nature fairly rigid. And Kanban, by definition, is very evolutionary. So by design, think about back to my analogy with the guy with the tires. At some point, they might figure out there might be a faster way to get the tires and the Kanban card will be changed. Right? Meaning he might get the Kanban card up here, might get the Kanban card down there. So changing the system is built into it. So it's evolutionary by design. Joel and I like to point out that when a company is first exploring moving to agile, we actually think Kanban is a great opportunity because you can evolutionary process. You can actually change your process as you continue and as you keep going through the process. One of our customers has a pretty interesting design where at the end of every couple weeks, they have a formal process that says, what do we want to change about our Kanban board? Should we change the limits? Should we change this? Should we change that? And they go in and they make very strategic decisions.
And I think, coming back to the comparison, Scrum is not as evolutionary. It's actually revolutionary, right? It shakes teams up. It changes the organizational structure from past models. It has a lot of rules and models that you follow in order to be Scrum. Management has to learn how to deal with a Scrum project differently than they might have used to been able to deal with other projects that likely didn't turn out so well, but there's a different cultural shift. And Kanban can get layered onto what you're doing today. In fact, you can layer Kanban onto Scrum. And in fact, a lot of our customers get to Kanban through Scrum because they find limitations or problems or frustrations with the Scrum model and naturally start to layer on top of some of these Kanban principles to evolve their Scrum processes, no longer calling it Scrum, of course, calling it Scrum, but. I do Scrum, but I also do Kanban. And allows them to evolve continually after that point. By the way, this doesn't just apply for software development. One of the other companies that we work with has actually changed their sales processes to use Kanban boards as well, interestingly enough. Because if you think about sales in an organization, what's the most important? Getting the lead or closing the sale, right? It's closing the sale, getting to done, right? That's where the value is at the end of the pipe.
So if you guys were in our session yesterday, we talked briefly about this, but since not all of you were there, we do need to review through this again. These are the core tenets or practices of Kanban. There's basically 5 of them, and we'll go over them, and then we'll show you, we have a slide that you might have saw yesterday if you're here as well, a slide of a Kanban board and how some of these things go to the board. And once we start looking at the visual board, a lot of the theory that we were just explaining to you should start to come together. So the 5 principles are defining a workflow and making it visual. Okay? And that's the process of defining the workflow that's unique for your organization and specifically unique for the project even you're working on. Each project will have its own workflow. I'd like to take a step back and even remind you, because Joel said we don't necessarily need to use Kanban just in software development, but we could also use it in sales and other areas, is a lot of people will define their own Kanban process in the analysis phase. So meaning is the analysis team might have their own Kanban workflow and visualize it. When it gets to done there, then it goes off to the developers. Okay, so it doesn't have to have one big, humongous process. You can have multiple process and multiple Kanban boards. So the customer I was referring to, they actually have 3 separate Kanban boards. One for kind of analysis and design, one for coding and construction, and one for QA and implementation. And it's really cool because they've taken over a whole office and made 3 of the walls the Kanban boards. So you can actually watch things flow from one Kanban board to the end, onto the other, onto the other, and onto the other. So that's the first principle. The other one is limiting the works in progress. So we've defined these methodologies, but we need to actually limit the works in progress. So the developers can only work on X number of items at a time. No one's raised their hand with a question yet, but I'm sure one of the questions is, how do you get to that number? It's a tricky one. It's really trial and error. Okay? You're going to have a feel for it at the beginning of the project from the developers if you've used Kanban before. But if not, it's going to be a lot of trial and error. And you're going to be changing your workflow and your works in progress often at the very beginning of the project. And then it will smooth itself out.
That's kind of interesting. I mean, when you think about it, it kind of makes sense. I mean, who here works really well when they're doing 20 things at once? Everybody? Come work for me.
Actually, he should be your assistant.
You need to be my assistant because I need help. The reality is that we build software and we're human beings. Software is about the human process, not about the technology side. Successful projects can only come about by having successful teams and the way that they interact with one another. And as humans, we don't do things like computers very well. We don't multitask very well. We context switch constantly, and context switching is bad. Do you know that every time that you switch between tasks, it takes you about 15 to 20 minutes to truly kind of get into the context again? So what happens when you're constantly interrupted or you're constantly doing 20 things at once? Your productivity as a whole goes down considerably, right? So when we think about how teams operate, guess what? Teams operate very much like that. When you have too many things going on, you're going to have a lot of things that are kind of juggling up in the air, but there's going to be a time where nothing will get done. You'll get, a lot of things are in progress, but nothing is getting done. So what we're trying to focus on is, give me one or two things at a time. I can get that done. Give me a backlog. I'll get it all done eventually. But don't make me try to do too many things at the same time. So we're trying to limit that and work the way humans work, which is naturally about limiting work in progress. So this makes a lot of sense to a lot of us.
Makes sense to me, Joel.
I hope so,
Makes
because you're up on stage with me.
I'm usually the one interrupting Joel, so I understand the whole change of context thing.
What?
So limiting the work in progress, right, which as Joel just said, helps us work more naturally as opposed to kind of ADD mode. Now, you might be thinking, this sounds great in theory, but what about critical bugs? We'll address that actually in a minute. We actually think Kanban is far better for addressing critical bugs, working the way humans work in that respect. But the next core tenet of Kanban is measuring and managing the flow. So at all times, you're measuring and managing the actual flow of the items through the system. Remember what we said, Kanban is about flow, pulling items through the system on demand. So we only want the items in the system that we're going to be working on, items that are, quote, in progress. So the product backlog is off. It's not even on the Kanban board. Only things that are going to be in progress are in the system. We're constantly measuring that flow because if we consistently see the developers idle, we know that we have a bottleneck in whatever queue is in front of the developers. And we'll have to make their work in progress limit lower. Or we need to maybe add some resources to the queue in front of the developers. And then maybe we can increase the work in progress for the developers. And this brings up an interesting point, one Joel brings up all the time. In Kanban, you don't see it. Like if this was a class on Scrum, I hate to do the comparison, but just for a frame of reference, you would see things like the daily Scrum on this list as a core principle of Scrum, right? Or you would see, a 1-week iteration or, have some form of a sprint, right? A 2-week sprint or a 4-week sprint. Kanban throws away the logic of the daily Scrum because it's obvious what we're working on by the Kanban board. However, there still is a daily meeting in Kanban. And what's interesting is the daily meeting is about the flow. It's about the process. It's about what's flowing through the system, how fast, which naturally, of course, will lead to other conversations about what's needed that a daily Scrum also facilitates. We'll get you one quick second. And this is Joel's great observation. He says, in a daily Scrum, we're facing each other. In Kanban, we're facing the board. And we're talking about the actual process and what goes through the board. Before I go through the next two, we had a question right here. Sure, excellent question. I'll repeat the question, and Joel will answer it. It's we mentioned that we can layer Scrum or merge Scrum and Kanban together, which Joel affectionately calls Scrumban. And the specific question was, that's great, but how do you then get away from iterations? At some point, do you just stop doing iterations?
Right, and that's a really good point. And what happens is that in Kanban, we have something called a cadence. It's a rhythm. So we still have a release rhythm because, if we're releasing to Facebook.com, we might be able to release a feature a day or something like that. But most of the rest of us need to coordinate with other teams within your environment and work with operations to get software deployed, and we end up having a release. So there is a time box in there. And then, so if we start thinking about time boxes, there's other types of cadences as well. One is a review cadence, so when you can sit back and kind of maybe do more formalized review of your customers. There's also a retrospective cadence inside of Kanban. Those cadences turned out to replace the sprints, right? So that's where they naturally start to transition to one another. So you might actually have the same cadences, but there's less rules around them. So for example, your retrospective cadence on how you can make your Kanban better might be every month. But your review cadence, where you sit down with your customer and review what you're delivering, could still be every 2 weeks or every week, right? So that's how those two start to evolve and devolve to one another.
And specifically as you are doing your iterations and you're evolving with Kanban, is you'll notice that Scrum has a lot of rules. And that's one of the things that we spoke about before. And we think those rules are good insofar as they force you every 2 weeks to release a product and talk to the users. I was joking, I think, yesterday or maybe it was my agile estimation talk. We hate talking to the users. So Scrum forces us by setting up things like the sprint review meeting and the sprint retrospective. And Kanban has none of that built in. But there's nowhere does it say you can't do those things around the delivery cadence. And that's how you would actually evolve your cadence cycles.
I also just want to make a really good, important kind of emphasis on the measuring and managing flow. Raise your hand if you estimate work. Pretty much everybody. Keep your hand raised if your estimates are 90% correct.
Before you answer that, who has increased their estimation based on my agile estimation class on Tuesday? All right, those guys are exempt from your question, Joe.
Okay. Estimation is difficult, and that's why we have agile estimation techniques. I want to take this a step further. Why do we estimate? Why can't we measure, right? Wouldn't it be great if someone came to you and said, how long will it take you to do this feature? And actually give them an answer that's about 95% accurate without having to estimate. That sounds pretty wild. Well, Kanban allows you to make very explicit and empirical measurements on the flow of your production system, right? We actually can measure how long it takes from things from going from the beginning of your pipe to the end. And we can measure this over and over and over again. And that gives us a lot of empirical evidence that allows us to make commitments more readily based on the evidence. You're not estimating them anymore. Why are you guessing? Guessing is hard to do. Measure, right? Measurement allows you to be much more predictive in providing what the future kind of looks like. And that's one of the reasons I personally love it, because guess what? After 18 years of building software, I still suck at estimation. So when will I ever get better, right? I won't. So I don't estimate anymore.
Joel, there is this cone of uncertainty.
Yes, I am.
Just to tie this back, because we did spend some time at the beginning about the theory and the roots of Kanban, and Toyota knows how long it takes to push a car through its system. And now you might argue, hey Joel, that sounds great in theory, that you can, don't have to estimate because you know how long it takes for a work item to flow through your Kanban system. But then doesn't that mean all of our work items are identical? In Toyota, the tires are identical. So Joel, what would you say to that?
Well, I mean, there's two ways of looking at it. You always ask me the hard questions. Do you notice that? There's two ways of looking at that. One is you try to get all of your things about the same size. Close enough. And we all try to do that anyway. We try to kind of get requirements down to 1 or half a day's worth of work or 1 day's worth of work. That seems very achievable. In fact, there's a lot of statistics that show that things that are about a half a day to a day in size are very accurate in terms of how long in terms of their estimate versus the actual time to deliver against them. Once they're really big, the estimates are really, really wrong. So that's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is to maybe having basic categories of that's a really big thing, that's a medium-sized thing, this is a small thing, and it allows us to estimate using these maybe even story points that allows you to kind of estimate broadly and then look at your cycle time, that measurement that I told you about before, for different sized things. Well, that's a pretty big thing. That will take us 7 days. That's a small thing. That should, our stats tell us that should take us about a day, right? That's one way of handling some of those issues.
And once you start getting good at that, we'll get your question in just 1 second. Once you start getting good at that, you can actually start doing service level agreements with your users around that particular delivery cycle. Right? So you're saying, okay, our cycle time for small, medium, large is 2 days, 4 days, 6 days. When a high critical bug comes in and it's determined that it is a small, you can guarantee that from start to finish, that will take 2 full days. You had the question right there. Just shout it out, or you can go to the microphone if you want.
I'll follow up on the previous question. So we talked about different sizes of the work item, but the developers work at different speeds as well, right? They have senior developers, mid-level developers, entry-level developers. We can expect that the same size work item will be completed at the same time by different resources.
Excellent question, which I'll repeat, which is, I'll paraphrase, it's great that you can distill it to small, medium, and large, but we also have developers of different capabilities on the team. And the developers on the team, my rock star developer might finish the small feature in 2 hours, and my junior developer might take, a whole day on that. How do you account for that in the Kanban system? I'll take a stab at that. Joel always likes to have the final word, so he'll punctuate what I say. But The way I say that is you're measuring the average cycle time for the entire team, right? Because it's not just one developer working on that work item. A Kanban system, just to fast forward what the board looks like, involves everything. It involves analysis, UI, test, and development. So you're measuring the work of the entire team, and that cycle time of pulling something through is a measurement of the entire team's work. So you're going to have historical averages that will work for that particular team. You want to add to that, Joe?
Yes.
Told you.
Funny you
As
should
long
ask.
as he agrees with me, though. Usually,
Well, and we still want to promote the agile principles. We don't want to silo work to individuals. We don't, we do want to promote the fact that there's going to be the entire team is working together to get the flow through. So in this particular board example, maybe we can go through a more detailed one, but if I have a block in my Kanban that basically says I can't initiate any new work. So for example, in this one, we have a work in progress limit of 3 under analysis. It basically already has 3 stickers in there. That means that it's full. That part of the pipe full, can't fill it up anymore. But so when I'm looking, I've got nothing to do. I've just finished my work. What do? I help him get his stuff through, right? I pick up the work that is still stuck in the pipe to help it move through.
because you're prevented from taking new work because of the work in progress limits.
So it's very difficult to start getting into individual measurements where now he started working on it, but now I'm helping him get it through testing, or I'm helping him get it deployed into the build. I'm like, don't worry about that, Steve. I'll do the build part. I don't want to look at your code, but I'll take the results, put it in the build, put some automated tests around it, just so we can get it out the door, so that we can now go and work on some new features together. So
All right,
that's kind of how it ends up working.
Before we go through the board, and then we'll talk a little bit about that, we have 2 more just to briefly go over, and then we'll talk how these relate to the board, we went to the first 3 before we had some questions. So the 4th tenet of Kanban is making process policies explicit, which basically means is how do you move something from one queue to another, defining what done means. And we'll show you how that's represented on the board. And the last one is using models to suggest improvement. Okay, so the concept of Kaizen, right, constant improvement in the Japanese business culture is baked right into Kanban. All right, let's actually talk about our Kanban board and how these things relate back to the actual board itself.
So some boards are really, really complicated. Some boards are really, really easy. This is kind of a board that represents, we took the snapshot because it's somewhere in between. A lot of teams, when they start using Kanban, literally just have swim lanes and a big number on the top that says how many sticky notes or how many items can be inside of these swim lanes. So let's take a look at what we have here. We have some major swim lanes. We have next, analysis, development, acceptance, and prod. But take a look. Those swim lanes are actually broken into 2 sub-swim lanes as well. And that has, ongoing analysis and analysis that is done. We also have ongoing development and development is done. Why do we have 2 swim lanes? Is because, well, we have a queue that represents where we can pull from as we're taking work in. So for example, when I'm done all of my acceptance testing and everything has moved into production, where do I go and get the next, where do I go and get the rubber from? I get it from the previous queue, which was done. And I suck that forward and move it into my particular queue, respecting work in progress limits, right? So some of the other aspects of this particular board is that we have, if you can see, the definition of done under each one of those swim lanes. This is something that the team has agreed upon that says, how do we know when we can take a sticker from one swim lane and put it onto the next one? We don't want to arbitrarily want developers to go up there and say, I'm pretty much done already, so I'll just move it over. I'm 83% done, I'll just move it over just to make it look good. What we've decided...
Or move it halfway across.
Yeah, just put it on the line, I'm almost there.
I've seen people try to do that.
In the development world, there's either done or not. There's no 83%. There's no 90%. There's no I'm almost done. It's either done or not. And that's all we truly care about in this particular environment. So let's understand what done is, and the team agrees what that is. So in this case, we have the goal is clear, the first tasks are defined, and the story is split. And obviously, you can see if necessary. These aren't hard and fast rules. These are guidelines, right? And we have each one of these. And we also have the ability to kind of to mark up our cards a little bit. So we have, the yellow sticky notes are tasks. The orange sticky notes are defects. That's kind of interesting. Now we're starting to merge bugs and requirements kind of in the same Kanban. You can do all this kind of stuff because it is flow. We have other red ones that say it's blocked. We have things that say completed. We can actually have panic features that we can look at the board and go, ooh, 2 stars. We're going to move that one forward, before we choose anything else, So we can put a lot of emphasis into what you're seeing on the board. And it's really interesting that when you walk into the room and you see a sticky note with a star on it, you can say, bam, that's priority, man. I have to work on that next. There's no guessing. There's no queries. It tells you stuff right away.
Tell them what the red numbers on top
Well,
are,
the red
Joel.
numbers on the top are work in progress limits. It's the rules, the very few rules that we have in Kanban that says you have to respect those rules. They're there for a reason. If the rules don't work because we have a bottleneck because of it, the team comes back and says, okay, how do we adjust that number to make sure that the flow is optimized? But you still have to respect the board. I have a great story. I work with a great team leader, one of the greatest team leaders I've ever worked with in my life. His name is Steve Porter. He talks a lot on Scrum and Kanban as well. And he has this really, great story that he usually talks about when he was leading one of the projects where the developer's natural tendency is to start working on something new, right? It's easier to go back to the backlog and start getting it going. It's like, no worries, I'll get started on that new feature. And his response is, what does the board say? The board says, no, you can't do it. He doesn't become the bad guy anymore, right? He's not the bad guy, the board's the bad guy. So
At least he's an inanimate object.
Yeah, he's just... And about that darn board. And, the team works together to get stuff opened up so that they can put more work into progress. But what does that keep us focused on? Getting to done. Focusing on the quality attributes that done needs to have and, getting stuff out into production.
Okay, before we move on to the next topic, which is still the board, I want to go back here to the principles of Kanban and just kind of show how they relate to the board. Right, the first one is define and visualize your workflow. Well, that's pretty obvious, right? We've defined a workflow and we've visualized it. And then we said limit work in progress. Those are the red limits on top, right? How did we get there? Obviously through an evolutionary, almost trial and error point of view, where we said developers can only do 3 tasks at a time because, we can only feed them from the analysis and they can only work at 3 at a time. The measure and manage flow is done by doing analysis on the board. If the board looked different on a regular basis, you would start recording that and seeing what worked and what didn't work, what speeded up your flow, what slowed down your flow. And then we have process policies being explicit. That's what Joel was talking about before, the definition of done. And then the last one is using models to suggest improvement. It's not really represented here on the board itself, but it's done by looking at the board all the time, and it will be glaring where there's a problem. So what I want to talk about is how many people are using some form of board in their environment today? Okay, so almost everyone. So a board is pretty straightforward. How many folks are in a distributed environment where a board is a pretty difficult thing to do? Okay, yeah, just about the same amount of people, probably about half the room on both. So we have a quick demo here, or we can actually spend as much time on it. It's a product that is built by a company called Elin, and Prewise. They're based in Vilnius, Lithuania, and they've built a visual board. It's not specific to Kanban, that they're very specific about, but you can build Kanban boards with it. And you can, connect this locally, connect it to a server, connect it to some third-party products, not mentioning any names, but Joel might run one of those third-party products.
Team Pulse.
And you also can connect it to TFS as a repository. So this is an example. You probably don't realize it, but I've spent a great deal of time taking this slide. Where is the slide, Joel? Taking this slide and then making the actual, the exact same slide kind of on the board, on this particular board, just so we can kind of take that demo a little further. So we have our work in progress limits. And in this particular case, you see how I have the sub-swim lanes? I defined the work in progress limits for the sub-swim lanes. So I have ongoing and done for each of our items, for analysis, development, acceptance. And then I have on my last piece here, move to production. And you'll notice that task, you probably can't see it in the back, says good times. That's a great task. We have a question, sir.
You can't finish development, you can't finish analysis until development makes room for
You can finish development.
Repeat the question, Joel.
So he was asking, can you not finish analysis before there's room in the development, right? You can get them all into done, right? So you can finish the analysis. What we're saying is that you still have used up the number 3, and you can't start any new analysis until you actually have room to move stuff from analysis done to development start.
So let me show you. Is I have, this analysis is done. Oh, let's just give it to the developers to work on. I try to move it into that, and it says that's going to cause a process overflow. I'm violating my work in progress. This is the equivalent of giving, me on the tire line at Toyota, giving me way too many tires, stacking the tires all the way up to the ceiling. Right? And Joel likes to, now you can see this particular tool will allow you to override that, which I've sent feedback several times that they shouldn't. Joel brings up the point, let's try to work like humans really work, one item at a time and things like that. So that's what it's meant to prevent. It's meant to eliminate the waste, and it's meant to eliminate the actual work in progress. Now, here's one thing I want to mention is this board right now represents the optimal situation. Meaning is every work in progress is kind of flowing through the system without a problem. We're at our limits. What happens if we have a critical bug and we want to pull it through the system? We actually, as I said, we have a particular problem. So here we can show you what a Kanban board would look like. Maybe I could just move some over here, move some around. A Kanban board that might actually have some actual problems. Right,
well,
so
here's one. Here's one that is maybe down your line of thinking. Let's go and add all of these guys to done.
You can override it.
Right? So I've got these all in done, and you're sitting to yourself, now what? That doesn't make a lot of sense. What does this tell you? There's a bottleneck. That's what it tells you, right?
And where is the bottleneck?
Where is the bottleneck? Dev.
Right. Actually,
or maybe it's not in dev. So let's go back. Let's keep on looking up, right? Maybe it's test. Maybe we can't move stuff into test because dev is blocked. So we keep on kind of going upstream to find out where that bubble is to figure out how we can remove the bottleneck. That's how you learn that there are bottlenecks.
Could it even be the opposite, where maybe say QA is representing everything and you're actually going through what feedback?
Sure, I mean, that's where you might want to put some additional done criteria. If you're finding that the quality comes to developers are going, this is not right, and we throw it back, that is an indicator. Actually, it's one of the things that we've done in our team is we have a third queue, which is rework. So we have ongoing, done, and rework because it was crap when it got there.
you mean a third swim lane?
A third swim lane, because that's an indicator to us that we need to put some additional criteria in place to make sure that doesn't happen.
Actually, we had a question there, and then we'll get to this gentleman's question. Shout it out or go to the mic and So the question is, when you have the high priority panic features, and these high priority panic features are, want to be pulled through the system, how do you pull it through the system if you're at the capacity? And then if you're going to, do what we just did right here, which is override, how do you do that without without destroying the value of actually having a Kanban board? There are a few ways to approach this. I'll give one. Joel might share another one. Is what I've seen done before at one of our customers is they will then say, we have a priority 1 feature. And Joel likes to joke, okay, the priority 1 feature is website, stop taking orders. Right? That's a pretty important feature. We should stop what we're working on. They've actually then removed the items out of the queue and pushed them back into the next queue and then pulled the items through. Is that how you've handled it as well?
That's exactly how, because you really do want to respect the work in progress limits. But the reality is that Kanban works really well for maintenance because bugs, when we start working on them, actually have that type of nature to it, right? We can never predict the impact of a bug. And we can't be like Scrum and say, well, we'll address that bug in the next sprint. Like, dude, the website's down. Sorry.
We have to wait 4 weeks.
Right. There was another question here.
And, okay.
The maintenance and bug thing, I'm thinking the testers, would they be part of 2 boards then? Because
Excellent question.
things aren't coming through to them until,
Yeah.
Repeat the question.
So will testers have their own board? Is that the question? Or 2 boards?
I have that built into the demo, sir. Thank you very much. I'll pay you later. Now, I didn't get that far because my flight was delayed, and you would think my flight being delayed, I would actually do more work, but I was depressed. And I started building an additional board just for fun because I thought we might get this question. So in this particular case, it's not for the testers, but this would be for the analysts. Okay, right? So I could actually go and build a board for them with their own work in progress that says, oh, okay, we're going to add, more particular items to this particular board. Once they flow through and finish at this board, meaning they get to finished specs, you look at my swim lane says send to developers, you would move that item to this board, into the next queue. Okay? So in theory, if you look at my board here, my move to production has no limit. Okay? So when you're handing off to another board, very potentially, if you choose, you may want to make no limit on that one if they're working on a kind of as-needed basis. Or if you're really in sync with the other team, you can identify your work-in-progress limits and keep them in sync with the work-in-progress limits that's downstream. We have a question there?
Oh, okay.
Is there a sense of assignment, like each of those cards? Is it a team assignment or is it an individual assignment? So you got blah blah and next. Has that been assigned?
There's no.
Or to the team?
So the question is there a team assignment or is it just individual assignment? So is your question about the tool or Kanban in general? Yeah, Kanban in general has no rule for that. It has no rule for how you do assignments. It actually tries to say, you know what, if you need to assign it to a team first and then to an individual, you can do that. But Agile really tries to promote pulling in work, right? So that you assign it just in time as well. So either you might assign it to the team because, oh, that's an installer problem, so I'm going to give it to the installer team. And then the installer team will then take it and hand it off to the person on the installer team with the right amount of capacity and knowledge to perform that particular task. Because remember, knowledge is in the utopic world, we can just pull tasks from here, but we also have knowledge and skill limitations. It's like, don't make me do design, because my apps tend to look like command prompts. So I obviously don't have the skills to take that, even though I might have capacity, I don't have the skills to do that. So, but if it's assigned to my team, we'll figure out who on the team has the right skills or even a combination of skills to actually move that along.
So before we answer this next question, we'll get you 1 second. I want to punctuate what Joel, what'd you say? Oh, I just want to punctuate what Joel said is obviously, Scrum, Kanban, XP tries to move away from having, tasks individually assigned to people. The whole theory of the cross-functional team. Kanban has a lot in that heritage as well. However, in practice, in the real world, if we go back to our Kanban board here, if you look at the South Park cartoon characters, I don't know if this was your design when you did this board, but one of Teleric's customers in Hong Kong that I visit all the time, they actually have little Polaroid pictures of the, well, they started off with different color stickies for different users. I'm sorry, for different developers, because they want to assign the task to developers. And then the manager told me, I basically bought out every multicolor sticky pack in all of Hong Kong. So then what they did is they take tiny little photos of the developers, very similar to the South Park, and then they actually get an assignation. So they're performing that. In the real world, they've decided we really do need to assign these tasks to the developer. But what's interesting is the manager doesn't assign the task. The developers kind of really assign it to each other, or it's pretty natural. They say, Bob, as Joel said, Bob is our UX guy, Joe is our database guy, and it kind of flows through the system that way. What I find interesting, what they've done in Hong Kong, is when they use the color coding and now when they use the photos, each person has their own work in progress limit. Meaning is, okay, so I can only have a certain number of tasks in my queue, so they only would have 3 stickers with their name on it or their photo on it in that respect. Back to the tool, then you can...
Well, it's kind of cool. I mean, the tool doesn't support this, but our Kanban board at our office has something very similar. Not only do we have vertical work in progress limits, we actually have horizontal ones as well, right? So when we think about design work in different teams, I don't want to overload a particular skill set or particular in my ability, so I have to take that into consideration as well. So you can really evolve this, and I guess that's what we're trying to say, that the only rules that you have is visualization and optimization. And so you can choose to pull in those practices quite naturally. It says, you know what? We need work in progress limits on skill sets as well, because my developer or my designer's got way too much work compared to my developer. Now, you had a question. Yeah.
Is it useful? I mean, I noticed on your slides and on your previous on your next thing, you have a limit on the number of things
Yeah.
coming up.
Yeah.
What do you do with the big pile of stickies? That
Your backlog.
yeah, everything else. Is it useful for your team to know that visualization, or do you just hide that?
Yeah, I mean, we still
Repeat
have...
the question.
So the question is, so we have a next column there.
Oops.
And there's usually a work in progress limit on that. That basically says, this is what you should work on next. So is it valuable to visualize your backlog? I don't know about your backlog, but I've got 1,500 things in my backlog, and sticky notes don't make a lot of sense. So we have either an Excel spreadsheet where people can see, or some sort of electronic list that has that backlog in there. What's really important, and I've seen other teams do it with sticky notes and having the backlog being a whole thing of sticky notes that they prioritize, actually literally, the higher it is up on the wall, the higher priority is. The product owner will just come and look at it for a couple hours a day and says, what? And put that up there, put that one down there, and he'll come back after coffee and it's like, nah, put that, And what's also really kind of cool is that the product owner will have the ability to fill the next queue as well. So instead of having a lot of discussion about what prioritization scheme they're going to use to put inside of the next column, the product owner will come in the morning and take something from the backlog, take something out of next, put it in there, saying, I want that to happen today, right? Or next. And then, to the team, it really doesn't matter, other than that if there's dependencies or something like that from an engineering perspective, you might want to look at it. But other than that, I mean, it all depends on how much work you have in your backlog. I've got too much to put it as sticky notes. My feature set, we have a hierarchical feature set, bug tracking and, really specific features, and it would be impossible to have sticky notes out of it. So we have an electronic version of that.
And I'll add to that before we take the next question is the customer I was talking about is called Nike, the shoe company. I'm not supposed to tell you that, so don't tweet that. And they actually know I brag about them. And what's interesting about them is they use Kanban in their manufacturing process. So I remember asking them very specifically the exact same question, saying, well, I'm not a big fan of having humongous backlogs. I agree. Joel should not have, 15,000 things in a backlog. For large projects, as I said in my Agile estimation class the other day, I prefer to have no more than 6 to 8 months worth of stuff in the backlog. When I asked Nike about this, and I said, well, I'm a proponent of keeping the backlog small, but you guys are keeping it really small. Now, granted, one is artificially low. I just did that for the demo. But I go, why is it so low? And they really came back with, all the principles from lean manufacturing. They really went back to back to Toyota with the tires. They said, where there is inventory, there is waste. Right? And inventory would be the work item, which means we paid somebody to sit and do all this analysis, and now they're off doing something else. And in reality, we have 1,500 work items in our queue. They're going to change. They're going to get forgotten, or that particular business analysis person, that BA, is going to leave the company.
Misunderstood.
Yeah. And if they wrote it 6 months ago, it's not fresh in the mind. Right, so they really were aggressive, and to be honest, they changed my thinking on it to some degree.
And I think you evolved to that point. I mean, because we've seen teams do that as well. And you try to record everything. Like you get a feature request from coming to a conference, they're like, I got to write it down. I'll put it in our backlog. Makes people feel better. But the reality is that the more people ask about it on our forums, the more relevant it is. And we don't really look at our entire backlog because it's just too much to work on. So we really end up working with probably a small subset anyway. So you could probably visualize the hot topics for the week or hot topics for the month of the most requested things, right? And allow those to be your backlog that you choose from.
I know we have a whole bunch of questions, so we have lots of time. We have just about 10 or 15 minutes to go. So what order should we take them? Goodness, we have a lot. Joel, you pick the next question.
What number am I thinking of? Just kidding.
There you go. That guy gets the next question.
You got it.
We'll work our way. We'll come back to you. We'll work our way to the center, so to speak.
There is danger in that.
Repeat the question.
So Scrum has done a lot of work to remove the walls between the team. One of the key premises of Scrum is to have a cross-functional team. and to get teams really working together in a high informative environment, not relying upon silos and transitioning between silos, because we all know that that's wasteful. There is a danger of that. There is and that's why we're putting this into the context of Agile, that what we need to do is keep the principles of Agile alive in this, and we still truly want cross-functional teams. We want a highly informative workplace. We still, in fact, that's one of the reasons I like putting Kanban on top of Scrum, because it's given us some great principles to work within. This kind of helps fine-tune it, help fine-tune those rituals. There is some dangers, and I have seen teams work like this to say, oh, I'm an analyst now, and I get to throw my work over the fence. And that's why I kind of kept coming back to, well, those aren't roles, those are states of value inside of your value chain, right? And they just happen to say analysis, but it doesn't say analyst. And we have to be very careful. For example, the testers on my team do as much business analysis and vice versa. My business analysts are my testers and support group, right? And they work on both sides of the spectrum. And my developers also know the problem space really well, so they help with analysis, but they'll also help with testing. They don't test their own stuff to help get things through. So we love the cross-functional team, but there are situations where there are unique skills. Designer is an example of that, where the designer does not write DB script, right? God, no, bad. It would look really nice, but
It would be format. It would be a good font.
be well formatted.
It'd be like
and have
Scott
a nice
Stanfield
font.
writing
That's
a
right.
stored procedure.
But there are specialties on a team, and this allows for that at least, and allows us to embrace that. But there are some dangers.
And one thing when we get a question like this, what we usually say is, come to our Agile buffet table, which would be like the next session. Unfortunately, it was yesterday, because Tech Ed magical scheduling methodology. But what we talked about yesterday in the Agile buffet table was just because you might want to embrace Kanban. Well, let's just go back to Scrum. How many people here perform Scrum? Okay, let me ask the question one more time. How many people really are doing Scrum but? Right, I use Scrum but. Right, so you're all modifying Scrum anyway. You're going to modify Kanban. Right, so, to help break down those walls and implement features of Scrum. As I said, Joel affectionately calls it Scrumban. So we don't want those walls to be built.
Before we take another question from a hand-raising audience, we've had a question on the Twitter queue for a bit.
Oh, that's a
and
cheating
this
way.
is a challenge.
A challenge.
This
I
is
like
a challenge
challenges.
to you and I.
More for you.
Mr.
I'm
Forte,
smarter.
when will Kanban not work? Are there environments where Kanban actually will not work?
Oh, that's a difficult question that I'm going to let Joel answer.
I have failed in Kanban before. I took a perfectly healthy Scrum team and tried to implement Kanban, and actually tried to implement it in its purity. Let's take away iterations, right? Let's just be happy and just flow things through. And they're like, awesome. It completely died. Everything fell apart. The rituals that team needed to have, the daily rituals, the daily stand-ups, the comfort, of switching on and off the light 4 times to know that your code will work. Those types of rituals. Don't you do that? They really help kind of solidify the behavior, the good behaviors that were enforced in the team. The team may not have been mature enough to directly jump into the Kanban world as quickly as I had wanted them to. But interestingly enough, so we stopped that. We went back to pure Scrum, and guess what we're doing now? We're starting to slowly introduce cognition over one of our sub-teams of what work in progress is. And they get it now. And they're starting to kind of get more in tune with the flow, but they're still kind of keeping some of their base behaviors in place. So they needed to evolve to that place instead of necessarily jump into it. Remember that this is behavior. And behavioral changes, even with Scrum. Remember your first Scrum projects? They might not have all been blazingly successful either because of one thing or another. That we have seen it fail when we try to maybe change too quickly or put too many constraints in place that might not make sense too eagerly.
And one thing I'll add about where Kanban may fall down and not work is where you have an inability to distill the work items down to equal sizes. And it can happen on some projects where the system you're building is just very complex with a lot of dependencies, and you can't get those work items down to one particular kind of manageable, digestible size. I think most projects can, but some projects would not be able to do that. All right. Anyone have a question in the real world, not on the Twitter world? Yes. We'll take you right there. Just shout it out and. It's on your slide here. Yeah, we've. So you're asking for completed versus done.
Like the production one?
Oh, yes. That's the task itself as opposed to the story. So you're asking is the difference between I have the ongoing for acceptance, I have ongoing, and I have two tasks in there, and one actually has a green, and that green task is completed, but it's not actually put into done. What moves through the system is the actual card and the story. Those are tasks that are supporting the story in this particular case.
So notice the definition of done. It's just that it's completed, but it may not have been evaluated as done yet. So we can mark it as, hey, someone else make sure that these things have been accepted according to our little acceptance criteria to move them into done.
Question right next to you.
Did you just ask that on Twitter as well?
Repeat the question.
So is there a way to represent dependencies between tasks? So that, I can't really do this one until this one is done first. Are they just sticky notes, or is there a way that we can represent dependencies? The answer is yeah. I mean, it depends on what tool you're using, but and this comes down to the principle of Agile is having a conversation, right? So when we move things over into our next, we evaluate them to look at their dependencies. It's like we can't implement, bug triaging without actually the ability to add bugs to the system. So that doesn't make any sense, right? So the team itself will look at these dependencies, if it's a functional dependency or an engineering dependency, and they might even do things like put the sticky notes on top of one another, or if you're using a tool like Agile Zen or something like that, make a relationship between the two things that show the dependency, that this task depends on this one, and when I try to move this other one through the flow first, it'll just flag as you can't, because it depends on this other one that's still not done.
And that can also be done with horizontal swim lanes to some degree. Is you can have a queue for, so it won't represent the dependencies, but then you won't be able to pull something through the system based on its work in progress limit. Any other questions? Yes, right here.
Yeah. The
Repeat the
question
question.
is, in the real world, doesn't water flow in the other direction as well, right? So when it gets to acceptance and it fails acceptance, what do? We might have more development or even more analysis work, right? I've even seen the feature get cut, which is done by a product owner, which is done at the very beginning. I mentioned at the very beginning of the session that we actually have an extra column for that. We actually have, in analysis or development, we actually have a rework column that is a representation of that salmon going back upriver. Something's wrong, right? And we don't like that column. If things are in that column, it's a flag to us that says something is broken in our process. We didn't understand the requirement correctly, something is broken. And that allows us to put those sticky notes back up the flow. So again, it depends on what tool. The question is, do you put history on these little sticky notes? When you first start doing this on a task board, you actually put date stamps, handwritten date stamps, and every time you actually put it through. Most of the tools that you use that allow for these types of boards have the built-in date stamps and will show you the progress of history for any particular item.
Yeah, as you move them through, it can actually go in and build burn-down charts and things like that when you're using an automated tool. When you're using the board, as Joel said, you'll kind of indicate that yourself. Yep.
Kind of explode out your story, you're exploding out and then tracking and exploding out as it do you encourage the trying to get that done when it first enters that swim lane, or is it just as new tasks are discovered, you just keep adding them? Like, you try to maintain that control of, let's try to separate it out into different chapters or whatever for the story. I mean, how do you address that?
I'm not sure I understood the question.
Yeah, I actually didn't hear the entire question, so. Okay.
So as things go along, it looks like you're kind of exploding out the story into little tasks. Is it the process where you try discovered, do you just kind of split it up? Is it more
So your question is, as the story is moving down the actual Kanban board, there are tasks that have to do with that particular story. And are you actually, redefining those tasks as you go along?
Well, like in our sprint, like in the beginning of the sprint, we try to break up our items into the smaller,
During sprint planning, right?
what in the, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it depends on how you guys work. I mean, you might still, if you're layering this on top of sprint, or scrums, you might just keep on doing that. But you'll always realize that as you get further and further along, you're always going to create tasks. I mean, even if you're doing pure scrum, you can never think about every task at the very beginning. So there's always going to be some capacity leakage in there somewhere. I like just-in-time stuff. I like trying to record things as we know it, but don't try to overthink things. Because we don't know what we don't know. So one of the things that we do differently is we don't necessarily Kanban all of our tasks. We really think about the flow of value through our system from a story perspective, and that's what we look at from a Kanban perspective. So we don't put a limit on how many procs we can write at the time, or how we're going to write our test cases. That's part of the value that gets flown through. So you have to think about the granularity of the sticky notes that you're going through. Rarely do you go right down to the task limit because a story could take 15 or 20 tasks to implement, right?
All right, we have 2 minutes to go, and Joel does have to go to the airport, so I think we can take one last question.
I think that guy has been raising his hand like a really long time.
Okay, which guy?
1. And the reason I say this is because I have my own personal Kanban, and it works like crazy. Because I love, I've got a lot of things to do just like the rest of you guys. And I use personal Kanban to actually record my own stuff and keep work in progress low. Keeps me focused. So my solution there is 1, because it works really well. In fact, there's a movement called personal Kanban that seems to be really big in the industry. It works across all team sizes, and it really works. Here's one thing that really is interesting. This scales to teams of 50, 60, 70 developers as well, versus Scrum is more difficult to scale because you have to break things down into sub-teams of 7 to 8 people, right? So it has a very wide scalability model.
And before we wrap up, I'll add to what Joel said, is when I first started using Kanban, it was a few years ago. It wasn't called Kanban. I didn't know I was using Kanban. I was using something very similar. Recently wrote a blog post about it. And we had a very small team. We had about 2 or 3 people. I wrote a story about building these regular expression patterns and this crazy workflow that we did. And it was a team of about 3 people. But as Joel said, you pretty much can use it with almost any size team. So it's going to be back to where Scrum has a lot of rules. Kanban does not have a lot of rules, and it allows you to build those rules yourself based on the actual environment and based on the actual team. What are you doing, Joel? Oh, okay.
Putting up a really good reference. It's called Limited WIP Society, Limited Work in Progress Society.org. Lots and lots of information about Kanban.
But specifically Kanban for software engineering.
Yeah.
Not necessarily, because if you Google Kanban, you'll find very few books and blog posts about Kanban for software, but you'll find a tremendous amount, because it's been around for 50 years. You'll find textbooks, Kanban for dummies, but it's all about the manufacturing process. A good read, if you have the spare time, but we're busy folks, so I'd probably start here. We are out of time, Joel. We literally have about 45 seconds to go. So you'll bring up David's book. So Joel will bring up a good resource, and I have no idea what he's doing.
I have no idea either.
What are you doing?
You just have a silly computer.
You just can't use Google Chrome. Microsoft horror. All right, there we go. He's going to pull up a book by a guy named David Anderson, which is just called Kanban, and it's blue. So that will help you remember it if you want to pick up that particular book. It's a great book. I've read it. Joel's read it. We highly recommend it. But with that, we'll conclude. Joel literally has to run out to go to the airport, so if you have some questions, feel free, you can come up and ask me, but Joel has to kind of take his microphone off and plop his computer in his bag and run out the door. If anyone's going to the airport right now, maybe keep up in that respect. But thanks for coming. Fill out your evaluations when you can, and thank you.